Wonderful. Glory to God. Calvary's still working. You know, back years ago, God knew our day and what we had before us and what was in line for us and what we'd face as an old-fashioned people. Knew that we'd need to come together and we'd need each other. And He had a man that could call us together. And thank God, it was Brother Harold Schmul, who has been the leader of our convention since its beginning. And I couldn't add to his testimony, and I sure wouldn't want to subtract from it. But I feel like that God has given to us the man of the hour for many reasons, and I believe to bring us together. And I think you'll marvel with me anew that God looked back there and saw this boy, this lad, with a testimony that's only speaks of Calvary and redeeming grace. Can't hardly wait, Brother Schmul. Can you come here? I want you to come over here. I tell you, if there's a man that has a group of men, and my colleagues will say this, that we really love, it's this man that God's given to us to lead IH Convention, and thank God for His burden, His concern for us. And Brother Schmul, I wanted you to just tell them where you came from and what God did. I told you that, didn't I?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, you do it.
Amen. Well, I'm reluctant to do that because I feel it focuses the entire evening attention on myself. However, Brother Gale has insisted for a long while that I share my testimony because he thinks it'll help young people. And if it will, then I'm more than glad to do it. Young people have always been my friends. And I've always had a deep interest in them. Still have. We're living in a day when there's a lot of youngsters that have the same kind of background problem that I have. The problem I had in my yesterdays was rare 63 years ago compared to what it is today. But the men on the convention committee urged me to tell this story because they felt that there's a lot of young people that are having struggles and battles over their background. And maybe if they could hear or see what God has done in the life of one fellow, maybe they could find courage and strength to go on and to live a holy life. Let God, through His grace, make them all they ought to be. I only have one verse of Scripture, and it doesn't really relate so much to this lesson as it does to my own testimony, my own personal prayer. It's in Psalm 130. Out of the depths have I cried unto Thee, O Lord. Amen. Now there's a very real sense in which all of us have come out of the depths. We've all come out of the deep, miry clay. And I'm sure there are many stories here that are more interesting than mine. But I have been asked to share with you, and so I will. Only because I hope it'll be of some benefit to someone else. In August of 1981, I found out that I was not who I thought I was. I thought I was Harold Schmul. But on a hot day in August, I found out that I was Harold Mitchell. The people that had raised me, that I thought and understood were my parents, were not my parents. The man that I thought was my father, Ed Schmul, had been dead for probably almost 50 years. The woman that I thought was my mother was now at the point of death. She would live about 2 weeks after this discovery and after this information was conveyed to me. It happened like this. It really happened over 40 years before It almost happened on my wedding day when on the honeymoon or shortly afterward, my wife said, "You know, honey," she said, "I don't think that woman is your mother." And I said, "What makes you think she's not my mother?" "I don't know. I got a feeling that woman is not your mother." Well, you know, that's a hard pill to swallow, and I did not believe it, nor did I receive it. But I heard that refrain every once in a while for 40 years, especially after we had made a visit. Dave, she'd say, "I don't believe that woman is your mother. You'll never convince me that that woman is your mother." And I'd always say, "Well, who in the world is my mother? If she's not my mother, it's the only one I've ever known." The man I thought was my father was dead for over 50 years, and she had married again. He's still living, and he told me recently, he said, "Harold, I lived with her for 41 years, and I never knew you were not her son until the day she told it." The day she told it, it happened like this. She was very seriously ill, and Lois and I went up to visit her some 90 miles away. Maybe Brother Wardlaw was with me, I'm not sure. Charlie and I, that's our husband, we went to town to get some medicine. While we were gone, Lois was left in the house alone with Vi, that was her name, Viola. And after it got quiet, Lois, in her own direct way, those old blue eyes, she said to her out of the blue sky, she said, "Mother, when did you get Harold?" And she said, "About 6 months after he was born." I don't know what all they said. I don't think they said much. I think Lois was so shocked or so happy or so something or other. I don't think they had much more to say, or maybe it's because I came in the house from town, and we got in the car, had a word of prayer, and hurried down, and we barely got 100 yards away from the house, and in woman-like fashion, she turned in the seat and said, "I told you so." And I said, "You told me so what?" "I told you that woman isn't your mother." Well, I said, "What makes you think that?" She said, "Because she told me she wasn't." Well, I said, "Tell me what she said." Well, she said that Ed, and that was her husband at that time, he was 11 years older than her, Ed brought you home, and he paid $150 for you. And I wondered, you know. I did know that they had tried to have children. As a matter of fact, there were 2 stillbirths. Ed was a fanatic about having a boy. He wanted a boy. Somehow or other, he found out that there was a boy in a halfway house. That's the kind of places that unwed mothers would take a child they no longer wanted, and they just sort of move them on into somebody else's hands. And so this is what happened. There wasn't a lot of legal protocol in those days. I tried to find out all I could, but there were no adoption papers anywhere. And probably the $150 was all that was necessary to pay for whatever I had eaten, or the father, medical bills, whatever problems were involved. And she told Lois, she said, "Ed brought the kid home and said I had to raise it." Now, she was probably about 17 or 18 at that time, because she was married to Ed at about 15 years of age. So I was brought to their house, and they raised me. I lived with them until Ed Schmul died. When I got home after getting this information, I asked a lot of questions, of course, on the way home. 1,001 things went through my mind. After all, I'm not who I thought I was. And so I got out my birth certificate, because I did have a birth certificate. When I graduated from high school, I tell you that because I want you to know that I did. It was a struggle, quite a lot of cheating to get through, but I managed to cheat and to make it. I really did. I went to Newcastle. I know Brother and Sister Wardlaw were with me that day, and I laid the birth certificate out on the counter, and I said to the lady, I said, do you have a pre-adoption record for this person? She looked down at the record and she said, who is this? I said, I'm that person. She disappeared, and I suppose 3 minutes, maybe 5 at the most, she came back, and there was a legal paper lying on the table. And it said, my father, Joseph Kremp. His address is rather a general delivery, USA. Mother's name, Josephine Kaufman Mitchell, age 20. A son. They didn't give the weight. I was told later it was 4 pounds, 4 ounces. His name, Harold Mitchell. Named several days after the birth. Now I think that Harold Kremp, see, I'm trying to find out who I am, and I can be anybody I want to. For a while, I speculated that I was probably a great-great-grandson of the Krupp family in Germany. The Krupps were very wealthy people, knowledgeable. They were industrial barons. And I think that Frank changed his name to Kremp from Krupp. He made his way to Canada, couldn't find anything to work at. This would be after the war. He was no doubt in the Kaiser's army, trying to find something to do. Germany had been devastated, got into Canada. The Canadians didn't like his German accent, so he managed to get over to Chicago. He couldn't find anything to do in Chicago, and so he hired out to a shipping outfit and got on an ore boat. And when things opened up in March, he got on board and started making his way around the Great Lakes. It was a lovely day sometime in April when they docked in Erie, Pennsylvania. Frank was a rough customer, a heavy drinker. He was just a man of the world. He was sort of bumming around. He'd left his homeland, and he was just trying to make out the best he could. When he came to Erie, it was a lovely time of the year, a beautiful springtime, and he was making the rounds through the bars. He was a barfly, spent the money he did make, gambling and running around, going from place to place. And in there he met a so-so girl, not a go-go girl, but just a so-so girl, whose name was Josephine. Josephine, eventually her name would be Josephine Kaufman Mitchell. He was in town probably 3 days, and Josephine was lonely, and Frank was sort of lonely and needed a place, so he went to her apartment, if she had an apartment. I don't know where they went, but I do know that in the time that Frank Kremp was there, that Josephine conceived and found that after Frank was gone, hey, I'm going to have a kid in the world. I wonder what Frank's address is. Well, she couldn't find out where Frank went to. Didn't know what all she knew that he was a sailor. He might have been a traveling salesman. I don't know. But I know this, that she waited several days, according to the record, before a name was given. I suppose she waited for Frank to show up, and they're going to name the kid Frank Kremp Jr., but Frank didn't come. So she just wasn't too happy about it, so she called him Harold. And she called him Harold Mitchell. She didn't give him a middle name or anything. But when she looked down on him and took a good look at him, skinny, squalling, no doubt, I understand I was very hard to do anything with, always have been hard to do anything with, and I suppose that's how it was. And they said the only thing I could keep down was something cold. And so they tried to get along. She just despaired and turned me over to the halfway house. At the halfway house, Ed came along, and he could buy a kid for $150. All I have to prove this is what Viola said. She said he paid $150, and Viola was tight with money, And I believe they did pay that much because Viola had a knack for keeping track of dollars and cents and knowing what was happening. So I imagine I was worth $150 at that time. I'm not going to try to tell you what I'm worth today. When my family heard about this, they were tremendously upset. My boys especially were unhappy to think that this woman knew all these years that I wasn't her child, and she never leveled with us. They had sent to Germany, and they'd got histories, and they got books on the Schmul family, and they'd done a lot of research, and they really wanted to belong to somebody who was something, you know. And they thought, sure, if they could get to Germany, there'd be a von or a van, or there'd be some kind of a title associated with it, you know. And now horrors. Here they come to find out that their father is the son not of an Arab prince, not the son of Abraham, but the son of a streetwalker. And it's quite a shock to the family tree. But the tree will survive. Frank Cramp did have an address, and I gave that to you. It's General Delivery, USA. And I'm sorry, my family's a little bit unhappy with me because I'm not trying enough to locate my father and my mother. I'm going to make a real effort tonight. If Frank Cramp is here, I wish he'd stand up. Frank, are you here? Josephine, are you anywhere in the crowd? I'd like to meet my father and my mother if I could. Well, my wife was really, I shared this with the church. Lois was really unhappy with me because she thought I was denigrating myself. I wasn't at all. I was just trying to, sort of get adjusted to the idea that I'm not who I thought I was. And one night in church, after I'd shared with the people, because I was trying to find Frank Cramp, and I was trying to do the right thing, and she stood up, and she never stands up to talk in church, and she never makes speeches, but she was playing the piano, and she stood up, and she was crying, and she said, I don't like to hear my husband talk this way. She said, I know he's got to be the son of somebody wonderful. Said, because I lived with him all of these years. And she was sniffling and bawling only like a woman can, you know. And so when she was done, I told the folks, I said, well, yes, you need to remember and pray for Lois. She preferred that I be the son of an Arab prince. And I'm not. I think maybe I may be a son of Abraham. I just came back from Japan and addressed the Evangelical Publishing Association there. And after I walked out, the executive committee were in a session, and they began to discuss my presentation and what I said and how I handled myself. And they said, now they knew nothing about this. They said, that Schmul, I think that must be Jewish. Well, that's not the first time anyone's thought that I was Jewish. I suppose like 8 or 10 times. Maybe I'm a son of Abraham. I can be a son of anybody I want to be. I could be a Polak for all you know. That's not bad. There's nothing wrong with Polacks. I could be a Dago. I don't know what I am. I can be anything I want. I gave my family a history at Christmas time a couple of years ago, outlining the whole thing, and they did everything but tear it up because they said, we don't believe that. I said, well, that's probably the way it happened. Well, anyhow, I grew up in their home, and they must have had money at one time. That's why I think that their name might have been Cramp. Or they could have been, I could have come from a Jewish family. Anyhow, wherever I went, people seemed to get blessed. That is, materially. They seemed to have money. Ed Schmul drove a 9-passenger Studebaker President. Does anybody here remember Studebaker President? They were a big car. They were an expensive car, and they had the jump seats. You remember that? And they were high-powered. Of course, they owned a car like that for a reason, because they were bootleggers. It was during the days of the Prohibition, and we lived along the lake, and we'd go down to the lake, and we'd meet boats, different size boats, different kinds of boats. And they'd load stuff in, and of course you had to have a good car to beat the Smokies. Now, they weren't called Smokies in those days, but The idea is the same, you know. Same kind of thing. You had to beat the feds. You had to beat the law. And that 9-passenger Studebaker would take you out of there and over the bad roads in a hurry. Now, this was way back in about 1927, somewhere in that area, you know, maybe 1928. So, of course, I didn't know all that. I have pictures showing Vi in a very expensive fur coat at Niagara Falls. And Ed's dressed very nicely. And, of course, the Studebaker president is always somewhere around. Those kind of things speak of money. You didn't have those kind of things unless you had a lot of money. But I remember when we lost everything. And I don't know what happened, but we lost it all. Everything went down the drain. Maybe it was a crash. I don't know. But I do know that we then went from pillar to post. The next chapter, and I want to say this. There are many sections in my life I have no recollection, including my education. And I know you're aware of that because from time to time various gaps show up in my education as I move across the scene. And so just blame that on the fact that I missed several grades along the way, and then I cheated on top of that to get through at what little I did accomplish. And so you understand that much of this will not really be high class. But they still knew how to make money in one thing. They moved to Lawrence Park. And in Lawrence Park, Ed got involved in the labor movement. The I Won't Work or the International World Workers, they were a communist outfit. And if you go back in the history records, you'll find that at the General Electric Corporation in Lawrence Park, there was a big and bloody strike. And it was eventually beaten down, the law, and the troops were brought in, and it was crushed. My father, Ed Schmul, was a part of that illegal movement, and he was one that was truly busted. And after that happened, he went into making liquor, moonshine, anything that he could sell to make money on. He managed to get a job in the roundhouse at Lawrence Park, but when they found out about his activities at GE, they canned him, and that meant the end of his work. And this would be probably in 31, 32, 33, somewhere in there. But he began to operate what they called a speakeasy. Now, they call them speakeasies because during the Prohibition era, you didn't want to get caught by the law. And we had a still in our basement where the stuff was made for a while. We didn't get caught with that still, but we got caught later on. But they used that still for quite a while. And then the people got hot on their trail. The nosy neighbors. Now, let me say something here. Here's where I've got my first wrong idea about the church. The people across the way were church people, and they were always peeking out the window. They were always looking out of the curtain to see who was coming in. We had a big high hedge, and I say it was high, it was 5 to 6 feet tall, and they did their very dead level best, like this gal down here with the spyglasses, to try to find out what in the world is going on over there. And so they went to church, and my folks hated church people because they were nothing but a bunch of snoops and spies. And if you're a snoopy church member, I hope something happens to your nose. Well, anyhow, those were difficult days. Those were hard days. And those were quite violent days. First of all, things in the home weren't good. My father was a big man. That is, Ed was a big man. Around 2 1/4, sometimes 250. One occasion it took 6 or 8 police to subdue him and get him in the paddy wagon and cart him away. He was a man of a terrible temper when he was mad. And he'd have the railroad fellows were his clientele. They're the ones he served. They're the ones that came to buy because they knew him from the labor thing and they knew him from the roundhouse thing. And they'd come to eat, and they'd come to drink and to spend some time. And there were some very, very sad things happened. Often they were drunk, cursing, fighting, swearing. Viola, my mother, was a short woman, about 4'11", built like a bulldozer, hard as nails. She was 11 years younger, and so the fellows were always sort of flirting around her. flirtations were going on. And after the place would clear out, then Ed and she would get into a real tangle over what had transpired, and he was intensely jealous. And she wouldn't back up. And there were sad and tragic times of fighting and throwing things, rolling pins and saucers and chairs or anything that was loose. And on one occasion, he caught her and forced her over the back of a sort of a Davenport. Do you remember those deals that were about so high and they went down and then they sort of stretched out? I don't know what they called them. Well, he got a hold of her and he folded her over that thing, and he had his thumb in her windpipe and her tongue was hanging out. Both of those big, powerful thumbs and the powerful hands were around her neck. And her eyes were rolling back in her head, and she was just about gone. She couldn't do anything but gurgle. I remember jumping on his back and clawing his face and pulling his hair and screaming just as loud as I could because I knew that she was being killed. He momentarily was so irritated by my effort in the thing that he let her go long enough to try to find and catch me. He never did. In the meantime, she got away and she lived to tell about it. That's the kind of scene that was repeated, not just once, but many, many times. The fighting, the brawling, the cursing, the swearing, the hiding, the running, the loneliness of it all. On one occasion, they were a little slow in getting rid of the evidence. Now, I know I'm talking to some folks that have been in speakeasies. I know I'm talking to folks who know all about the language, and so I know it's not a strange language to you. But we always tried to have things ready so they could break the jug. You could be serving this stuff, but as long as there wasn't any evidence, they couldn't do anything about it. And time again, we'd be tipped off on a raid, and we'd get rid of the stuff. But on this occasion, we missed it. And on this occasion, they came in and they got the evidence before it could be disposed of. They took Ed away and put him in jail. I wasn't a very popular character in school anyhow. I'd go to school late, so I was the last one in. And when it was time to be dismissed, I'd be the first one to hit the door because they'd beat your face in. I became a track star later on and got my early training saving my face in Faulkner, New York. That's how I did it. I had to run home every day. And they were running after me, calling me a bootlegger and a lot of other names that were just rather uncomfortable to bear. I lived a very lonely life. I wasn't included in anything because I was the bootlegger's kid. I was on the outside. It was a lonely way to go. Well, I can remember going down to the street corner one night after the gang was all finished playing nip or kick the can or whatever they were doing. And I can remember Ed was in jail. I don't know what Vi was doing. She was probably trying to make out as best she could at the house. But I went down and I walked under the old street light, and I cried, only as a kid can. I was lonely. Nobody seemed to care. Ed was gone. I had no idea what was going to happen. It wasn't long after that when we were so completely busted we had nothing. My mother, Viola, had a half-sister who was married to an executive of Armour and Company. And she came through once in a while, and she was a Pentecostal. And she didn't like the way Vi was living. She didn't like what Ed was doing, and she didn't like him raising this Harold in this kind of an atmosphere. And she's probably the only other person that really knew about my past, but I never knew it in time to find out anything from her. She came by one day and she said, Ed, he'd gotten out of jail. I guess she'd paid the fine. Ed, she said, I bought a little farm over in Frewsburg, near Frewsburg, New York, and it's got 2 horses, and 5 cows, and 3 or 4 pigs, and 25 acres of land. You can just move over there and you won't have to pay any rent, you won't have to do anything, and you can get out of this mess that you're in. And so he accepted. No automobile, couple of horses, Kit and Queen, the old team. I'd never been on a farm before. Schoolhouse was about 2 miles away. I had already missed a lot of school. I'd missed more there. They moved in out there, and we lived there about 11 months. One night, about 4 o'clock in the morning, Viola cried, "Buddy, Buddy, Buddy, get up, get up." It was a hot August evening. I was sleeping downstairs with just my little blue pants on. Didn't own PJs and all that fancy kind of stuff. I slept down there because I usually slept upstairs, but it was so hot up in the little loft I couldn't make it, so I slept down there. And in the night, this cry came, "Run, get a doctor as quick as you can. Something's happened to Daddy." I remember taking a quick look in their little bedroom, and I can see him yet, spread eagle on the bed, eyes rolled back, mouth open wide. No doubt he was already dead. There's about a half a mile or farther to the first telephone. I remember going down the gravel road and praying my first prayer. I'd only heard one other prayer before that, and that was Aunt Pearl, the Pentecostal. She had prayed in that house, that little old farmhouse, after we moved in. She came by. She lived in Oklahoma. She came by. She wanted to take me to Oklahoma. She wanted to take me to Tulsa, brother, and put me through Tulsa University. And I'd have been smart today if I'd have done all that kind of stuff, you know. But she came by and she had prayer. That's the first prayer I ever heard in my life. The next prayer I heard was the one I prayed going down the road. "Oh God, don't let anything happen to my daddy. Don't let anything happen to my daddy." But it had already happened. I just give you a little aside. You know, in those days, burials were a little different. The body was embalmed and put in the front room there. And you know, I just didn't have anyone close. I was really closer to Ed Schmul than probably anybody else. And now he was gone. I remember the fellas came in to do the chores and to help out until the funeral was over. I remember how they laughed and joked, and I couldn't understand how they could laugh and joke when my dad was dead. I remember going in, standing by the casket, the roses blooming on the outside. It was the month of August. It was a strange world. We moved from there and went to Dunkirk, where he was born and raised. And he was buried in the cemetery in Frewsburg, New York. I remember moving into Dunkirk for a while, and this was the beginning of another chapter, a sad chapter as far as morals and as far as decency was concerned. There are many things, of course, I'm not free to tell you, but we moved there, and I began to live alone all the time. My mother was gone. It was bars and dives and men. It was running around. I was alone probably 20 hours out of every 24, and I suppose I was about 11 or 12 years of age. Number of dates I'm not too sure of. Just sort of. And I didn't know a strange town, strange city. I didn't know a soul. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any money. I was on my own, such as that was. I really don't know how that time went there. It didn't last long, maybe a month or two, and then she moved again. This time she moved to Falconer, New York. We moved into a cold water flat, and we had men coming there from time to time. And I remember there was some kind of a real bad fracas where the cops came in and took her revolver away from her. There was some kind of a fight, and some kind of threats were made with a gun, and they came and took the gun away. She had sold the rest of the guns. Ed was a pretty good hunter. She'd sold the rest of the guns, but she'd kept a revolver for personal defense, apparently. Well, she was in trouble with the local police, and she was under their surveillance. So she moved out of there and moved down on Main Street. It was cheaper rent. There were more people lived up there, and there was just big hollow rooms with hardly anybody or anything in them. And once again, I was back doing my own thing. We seldom would see each other. I didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what I was doing. And the apartment, since she was seldom there, became a hangout. It was a place for games, the wrong kind of games, card games, gambling games. It was a place for the wrong kind of living. However, I didn't find this out till many years later. In that apartment was an old couple. Their name was Everett. They were really old and beat up. They must have been at least 60 years old. And I found out later on that they were religious fanatics. And but I didn't have any time for them, and they tried to be nice to me, but after all, you know, when you're a teenager, you don't have time to be nice to anybody, especially when you're on your own, and you're smart, and you're doing your own thing. Well, anyhow, there I started going to school. I don't know how much I'd missed, but I started going to school. I remember my first day in school. Faulkner had the first consolidated school in the state of New York. And they were very proud of their school. And they had a large assembly. They had about, I suppose, close to 700 were to gather in the assembly hall on Friday. Now you must remember that I was lonely, that I didn't have any attention, that I wanted attention. Is that wrong? Is it wrong for a child to want attention? I think not. Some of you older folks don't mind a little, do you? Did you ever have your wife say, why don't you pay some attention to me? I mean, that's the idea. Well, anyhow, I remember that first assembly, and they all filed in, and there was a fellow that was leading the orchestra. His name was Ortolano. And Mr. Ortolano had a very lovely orchestra, probably 35 pieces there, and he began to wave his baton, and they began to play. Now, Ed Schmul had taught me that only sissies would dance, and only sissies would listen to highfalutin music, and that a real he-man just didn't have any time for that kind of stuff. And so when Ortolano started this real sweet stuff, you know, and this beautiful sweeping kind of thing, I figured it was time to put a stop to the whole mess of nonsense, and I jumped up on the seat, and I said, "Boo! Boo!" Well, I started getting attention right away. It's amazing. People being and hauling. Somebody said, "Get that kid down!" Boo! You know. Well, I got down. I really did. I had to. I couldn't stand up any longer. Well, it calmed down after a while. Everybody was looking, believe it or not. Oh, where in the world did this wild animal come from? What was that crazy noise? What in the world is going on here? Who is that kid anyhow? Where did he come from? This is the first assembly in the new year. No one had a chance to get acquainted with me yet. And we went back to our homeroom, and we all found our seat that had been assigned to us. Wasn't there long, then the telephone rang. And teacher picked up the phone, and yes, we have a boy here by that name. Yes. All right, I'll send him right down. She said, Harold Smoky Schmul, go to Mr. Wilbur's office. I didn't know where Mr. Wilbur's office was. Oh, where is that? You'll go down and down the hall, and you'll find it right down there. You'll find it. So I went down there, and I thought, well, I'm getting attention already. They're recognizing me. I'm here. And so I walked into the office, and the secretary met me. And she said, what can I do for you? And I said, I'm Smoky Schmul, and Mr. Wilbur wants to see me. And so I came into Mr. Wilbur's office, and he looked me up and down, saw the scraggly clothes that were on my back, the unkempt appearance, and said, you Smoky Schmul? I said, I'm Smoky Schmul. He said, Smoky, he said, you don't like it here, do you? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, you don't think that Mr. Ortolano can lead the music, do you? I don't know. I said, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to let you lead the orchestra next Friday in assembly. I said, oh, Mr. Wilbur, I couldn't do that. I could never do that. Oh, yes, you could. I believe you've got what it takes. I think I could do it now. I've watched Darren Wolf. But anyhow, he said, oh, yes, you could. And we argued a little bit, and I won. I said I couldn't. And he said, well, you don't seem to think Mr. Ortolano can. And, but he said, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. He said, we're going to let you observe for a while before you have to do that. And he said, let's see if we can't do a little bit better the next time we meet in assembly. He said, do you think you could do better than what you did? I said, I think I could. And so I did. One day, shortly in the spring of that year, I came out of the schoolhouse, and an officer came up to me, and he said, is your name Schmul? I said, yes. He said, got something for you. Oh? He handed me a nice official-looking envelope from the Chautauqua County Court. I said, what's this? Well, he said, you can read it when you get home. I opened it up, and I didn't know what in the world it was saying. I got home, and sometime during that weekend, I saw my mother, and I said, hey, did you get one of these? She said, yes, I got one too. I said, what's it mean? She says, it means we've got to go to the court. I said, what'll happen? She said, I don't know, but she said, you may be finding another home. Well, really, I didn't have a home, but I understood what she was talking about. So we went to the court. I had already been in quite a lot of problems. Nothing big enough to really get me in a real jam, but just enough to let everybody know that this kid is on his way to a lot of trouble, and it won't be long. Since I was so young, they put me under the jurisdiction of some social agency, and it was at the end of the school year, they decided that they would put me in various homes and out in the country, way out in the boondocks. At least that's where I thought they were. And so they came and they took me away from the place I called home, and they took me out there. But everybody was scared to death of me. They thought I was going to burn the barn down, I was going to kill the horses, or I'd break the legs on a cow, or some dumb thing. That kid, and I didn't last. I was in 5 homes. School doesn't get out in New York State till the last of June, and from the latter part of June to the first part of September, I was in 5 different homes. They'd have me a few days, and they'd call up and say, come get this brat. We can't stand this kid. He's going to set fire to the haystack, or he's going to burn the barn down, or we don't know where he's at. He crawls out the upstairs window, and he roams around, and we don't know where he's at. We can't keep track of him. And so I got shipped off someplace else. You see, back then, that's one way people had of making money. And if they were a real hard case, they got 4. They got 4 for me. And I know that one party put in for a raise shortly after I came. So they felt like they were really earning their money, you know. And so I just went from one place to another. But I came back to school, and by the way, I've got to put this in because this is so important. I was so smart in school that they let me take the 7th and the 8th grade together, or maybe I was so far behind. I'm not sure. For a while I thought it was because I was so smart they let me take the 2 years in one. Then after a while I began to wonder if the teacher in those grades didn't want a recess, and they just sort of advanced me. But anyhow, I did manage to get through the 7th and the 8th grade in 1 year, which was, I thought it was a great accomplishment, and I'm sure the teachers did too. But anyhow, I came to Faulkner, and they said, "You're going to a new home." And this would be the 5th one. And they said, "This way you'll be able to go to school, and you're going to stay right near the schoolhouse. You won't have far to go." And I remember the first day I went over, when they hadn't moved my clothes over there yet, there wasn't a whole lot to move. I went over there to the house, and I knocked on the door, and a small, moon-faced, blonde-haired woman stepped to the door, and she peered at me intently with her blue eyes, and I said, "I'm Smoky Schmul. I understand this is where I'm supposed to come." And she looked at me, and she said, "Yes." And while I was listening to what she had to say, and when will you be coming, and so on, I looked past her into the house to see what kind of a ranch it was, you know. Because after all, you had to know a lot about these places to know how to get in and how to get out. And when I looked past her, I saw the first religious symbol I ever remember seeing in my life. Some of you have had this religious symbol in your home. I looked past, and there's a little motto on the wall of a lamb. And it said, "Behold the Lamb." Remember that one? How many remember that motto? Behold the Lamb. I thought, that's crazy. What in the world does that mean? What's that all about? I had not the faintest idea. Well, I came there. They had been saved just a short while. They were not very bright converts. He was still having trouble with tobacco, and she always had trouble with her temper. But they were struggling. And they should get credit for doing what they did do, because I owe them a tremendous debt. I was in their home for a little bit, and I really wanted to make good. I think I must have been improving a little bit. And I remember so well making a bargain with them. They wanted me to go to church, and that's one thing they said, "When I come to this place, you'll have to go to church." So I agreed to go. But I didn't have to go to their church. I could go to any church I wanted. So I knew a pretty girl at the other end of town. I thought I knew what church she went to. Naturally, you go where the pretty girls are. That became my church, although I never did attend. I just sort of moseyed down that way on Sunday morning. But I sort of thought I was smart and rather sharp, and I knew how to make my way. I was street-wise. I was worldly-wise. I figured I knew how to handle people and manipulate folks and get what I wanted. And I thought the best thing for me to do now, I liked the school, and I was getting in with of course, I was in with a gang. I was in the wrong kind of gang. Those fellows were all much older than I. They were 5 or 6 years older, and when you're 12 or 13 and you're running with guys 18, 19, and 20, they had postgraduate courses back in the Depression days. You learned a lot you couldn't learn anywhere else, you know. And so I was with that kind of a crowd. But I wanted to be with them, and I didn't want them to know everything that was going on. So I made a deal with them. I said, "Well, I'll do this and you'll do that." And so we got back and forth. They wanted to keep me because they were getting $4 a week for taking care of me, and they really needed the money desperately. And so they really wanted to make it go. Well, they came to me with this idea, "We're having a revival in our church." I had no idea what a revival was, and they said, "We have a YMWB band. We'd like to have you come to our band." Oh, when I thought of a band, I thought of a real live band. I mean, like we had last night. And I went there, and it was a fizzle band. It was a pseudo. There's no band there at all, like a rubber band. It just might as well told me it's a rubber band. Well, anyhow, then they came up with another deal. "We want you to go to a revival meeting." And I said, well, I never heard of a revival, didn't know what it was all about, but I decided that if I could swap off something, I had a real big project I wanted to be sure to be in on. The guys were going to do a real thing, and I didn't want to miss it, and I didn't want anything to flub it up, and I sort of liked it where I was at. She was a good cook, and she made good bread, and she had nice sweet rolls, and I tell you, I was eating like I had never eaten before, and I sort of liked that kind of thing. And so I made a deal. The deal was that I could do that, providing I went to the revival meeting. Well, I think you know the story. My father had always told me that preachers were sissies, and that people that danced were sissies, and he told me that churches were dangerous places to be. As a matter of fact, he said, when I was a little boy, he said, never walk by the door of a church. He said, you know what will happen to you? He said, as you go by the door, he said, some guy in a big, long, black thing will come out, and he'll throw that thing around you, and you'll disappear, and you'll never be heard of again. And, of course, anything he said had to be the gospel. That had to be true. And they were talking about going to this church. I was full of fear. But I had a friend that went that night. His name was Bert Hall. And we and another guy by the name of Bud Johnson, we sat the second seat from the front. The guy who got up to preach that night was a tremendous violinist. He was also a tremendous preacher. His name was Floyd Bradley. Anybody here ever hear of Floyd Bradley? A Nazarene evangelist, and a great one at that. Well, Floyd Bradley, do you remember him? Floyd Bradley preached that night, and let me tell you, boy, he preached on hellfire and the judgment, and I could smell brimstone. And you know, it's one of those meetings where I was sitting on the second seat from the front. I was seated on the end of the seat, and I was satisfied by the lurid stories he was telling and everything else that came in there, and what he was talking about, that somebody had dumped the whole business concerning my life on his lap, and he just told the whole crowd. I absolutely felt that he knew the whole thing. Well, of course, it's my first time in a preaching service. I'd never heard the gospel before. And he preached and thundered and jumped up and down, and then they gave the altar call. Of course, I know it's an altar call now. I didn't know it was an altar call at the time. And I didn't understand the language. He got up and they sung a song. And I thought he said, if you'll come down here and kneel, you'll be safe. He really must have said, come down here and get saved. I thought he said, come down there and be safe. Well, I had listened to what the man had said, and I knew that he had said a lot of things about me. And the way that thing was situated, they sung a couple verses and nobody responded. And he started down off from the platform to come down. Where he was going, I have no idea. Of course, I thought I knew where he was coming. I thought, he's coming after me. And I said, no, listen, buddy, you said if I'd get up there, I'd be safe. Now, my dad told me this is a terrible place to get into a church, and you never knew what preachers were going to do with you once they got you in the inside. But unless you're a big liar, and preachers shouldn't be liars, I'll hit that. And man, like that, I was up there and on my knees. I don't know what I did. I think they thought I got saved that night. I don't know whether I got saved or not. I have no idea what happened. I really don't know when I was saved. Now, I know you're going to question my conversion, but I really have no idea. I can't give you the day or the time. But I do know that that was the beginning of, and I wasn't a very bright convert. I wasn't the kind of fellow that folks would write home about. And even after I did get, quotation marks, saved, I still wasn't too good. I did some things as a young convert that, would I dare tell them? For one thing, I cursed and swore a blue streak after I was saved. One night after football practice, I came in the locker room with a bunch of others, and I'd always, I'm not saying this in any sense of satisfaction, but swear like a sailor. I always had a ready grasp on language and always said whatever I wanted to say and say it the way I wanted to say it. And that night, we came in from the practice. I was the lightest fellow on the team, 110 pounds. I was the watch fob. But I played. I was hard and tough, you know. But I'd gotten religion, and it was the talk of the school. Everybody said, hey, Smokey got religion. Can you believe it? Nobody could believe it, of course. It was the chatter up and down the hall. Somebody gave me a big Bible about, I guess it was about that big and about so wide and so thick. And I carried that. I didn't know anything about a crazy Bible, but I knew that Christians carried Bible, and I kept that thing there and often would break out of my room and run and get my Bible, but I really didn't know what to do with it after I'd picked the thing up. I just sort of wave it around, you know, think maybe there's some kind of a magic power in the thing that would, but it didn't impress too many people, and I'm sure I didn't impress. I wasn't a very bright convert. When I jumped up on this bench this night, I was pretty well dressed. One of the guys said, hey, Smokey, How about going up here to the city line and we'll have a real ball? Let's really do it this time. What do you say? Will you go with us? Of course, they were just really trying to give me a time, you know. And I said in my most authoritative voice, blankety, blank, 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 blankety, blank, blank. I don't go there anymore. Well, they laughed louder than you're laughing, believe me. That place went up in a roar. Wow. My face got red. I tell you, I didn't know what in the world to do. I got out of there as quick as I could, and I went home, and I said to the woman, her name was Georgia. I said, Georgia, I swore I cursed a blue streak. She said, that's terrible. Well, I knew it was bad, and frankly, I'm telling you honestly as I know how I thought, I had probably lost the only chance I ever had of getting to heaven. And I really didn't think that God would give me another chance. And coming home that day, it just filled my heart so full. Well, you blew it. You can't make it. And you knew you can't. Because after all, look at your background. In sociology, we had studied the Jukes families, and they were all a bunch of ne'er-do-wells and pimps and harlots and scoundrels, you know. And then we studied the Edwards family in sociology, and they were all lawyers and doctors and school presidents. And the devil said, you don't have to study too hard to know where you came from. This is your tribe over here. And so I just didn't think I had another chance. She said, well, make a little altar in your heart and ask Jesus to forgive you. Now, religious people never do know how to give instructions, and she didn't either. And when she said, make a little altar in your heart, all I could see was a bench about 24 feet long. And I looked down and wondered how in the world that thing had ever fit in here. And I guess it just looked pretty dumb. And she said, oh, I mean go away somewhere and pray and make that little place an altar and ask Jesus to forgive you. The light dawned. I didn't know the scriptures, you know, we have an advocate with the Father. I didn't know anything about that. But I can tell you what I did. I walked out of that room and I came through the little shed. It was a bright October day, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe 5:30. And I can remember standing on the second step from the top. And I looked up and said, oh, Jesus, I'm sorry. I don't know why I did that. Will you forgive me? If you'll forgive me, I'll try. You know, when you lose most of your vocabulary, it's rather hard to express yourself when you've been rather a forceful expresser. And it's taken me a long while to learn how to put things together so I can say them like I want them. But, you know, that was one of the most valuable lessons I ever learned. He forgave me. I stumbled around. I played football in college. Football in high school. I ran track. I did a lot of things that the people might... Do I dare tell this? You think it's all right to tell it? Well, I'm among friends, and maybe you'll understand somebody someday if you listen. But I did play football. I ran track. I had struggles about it, but I did it anyhow. The folks in the church I couldn't understand. Come on out and see me play ball. Hey, Brother Armstrong, I'm playing tonight. First string. I'm going to run the mile. I've set a record in the half mile. Come out and see me. Maybe I can break it tonight. I couldn't understand why they just shake their head. Are all the preachers listening? Are all the altar nurses listening? You know, nobody ever chided me. Nobody ever took me to the woodshed, cleaned my clock. I think I've lost you. I think you've all got a hardening of the arteries all of a sudden. You know, they prayed for me. I was the high priest at the school festival. I didn't go to dances, didn't go to those things, but I've always been sort of a social kind of a fellow. I always liked people, so I was just always in the middle of things. I was elected the most likely to succeed. I was elected the May King. I was elected the high priest, just all of these things. And I couldn't understand why the church people wouldn't come see me. I see some of you are struggling. But I got through. They loved me. They put up with me. They were kind to me. And they saved me to God and the church. I thank God for His saving grace. I thank God for His redeeming love. You know, what two young people thought of as their moment of pleasure 63 years ago. The illicit affair somewhere along the trail, just thinking of their own selfish satisfaction. That night when Harold was conceived, God was there. And He has chosen me in Himself. I only tell this because I know there are young people that may be adopted. There may be young people who are like myself, the son of a streetwalker. I don't know what your background is, but young people, God showed me one day that there were the Jukes families, and there was the Edwards family, and there were a lot of other problems and social problems, but that when I was born again, I became a member of a new family. And that it's a new bloodline. I have an elder brother. He's most wonderfully kind. My elder brother stood by me across all these years. I'm no longer lonely. I don't walk underneath the streetlights and wonder. I walk in the shadows. I walk in the darkness. I walk through the valley. I have gone through some problems just like you have, but my elder brother's always been there. Always taken me safely through. Never has failed me yet. And if you're here tonight and you've got a sorry past, you've got a deep scar in the yesterdays of your life, Jesus Christ can make all the difference in the world. You know, as I look over, and I'm about finished here, Brother Gale mentioned his background. You know, some of the men that God is using in an unusual way today came from rough background. There's S.D. Heron. There's S.I. Emery. There's William Gale. And there are any number of others whose names I could mention. But you know, when the blood covers, and when Jesus comes in, when old things pass away, you get to be a member of a new family and the household of faith. Amen. A new day. Glory be to God. I believe very sincerely that each of us are children of destiny. When I think of what God has done, where He's taken me from, the handicaps that I thought I had, the problems in my past, God's grace has been sufficient. Amen. I am what I am by the grace of God. Amen. And I know there are youngsters here tonight that have checkered backgrounds and that have a checkered life. And maybe you're unsaved. Maybe you've been on dope. Maybe you've been an alcoholic. Maybe you've violated every law of God and man and lived like an animal. And many have. But there's a change that can be made, and you can be a new creature in Christ. Amen. Shall we stand?